As a child, I lived in Conakry, Guinea for a few years, and I remember quite vividly my siblings, my cousins, and I playing a game that we called Power Power, which pretty much consisted of us twirling with our arms stretched out this way every time the electricity would go out at the house, and sometimes until it came back. Let me tell you something, we played for a very long time, very often. This is, of course, not me dissing or denigrating Guinea, but rather sharing a personal anecdote to illustrate a long-standing issue in many parts of the continent where electricity has been unreliable, unsteady, and in the worst cases, inexistent for a long time. But why is it exactly that a continent that is expected to double its population by 2050 from 1 billion to nearly 2.4 billion is still lagging behind on a fundamental thing such as access to electricity, especially when we know that Africa is home to most of the sources of energy needed to produce said electricity? Well, in this new episode of Beyond the Noise, we're going to take a closer look at our power problem, and of course I mean our electric power problem. Before we get into this topic, it's important for me to specify that on this channel, we don't claim to look at issues from every single angle and aspect. We dive into the hows and whys and strive to provide some of the answers needed to further a conversation. But you can only do so much and say so much in a 10-minute digestible video format. So if you want to dig deeper, we urge you to. So be sure to check out our description box for additional reliable sources and resources. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, support our research and independent journalism content by liking and sharing what we produce, and turn on your notification bell for more videos like this. Now, without further ado, let's get into this video. First and foremost, let's look at what the actual coverage of the continent looks like. When we compare how many people have access to electricity across Africa, the numbers can be quite different. In North Africa, about 99% of the population has electricity. But when we look at sub-Saharan Africa, it's a different story. Overall, under 50% of the people there have access to electricity, according to data collected by the International Energy Agency. Let's talk about a couple of specific examples. Nigeria, which is a major economic power in Africa, had the highest number of people without electricity, with 93 million still lacking access in 2015. On the other hand, Mauritius had the highest rate of electrification, with 100% of its population having access to that energy. When it comes to urban areas, Cape Verde and Mauritius had the highest rates of electrification. This is probably because these island countries have a high population density and their territories are relatively small. Conversely, wider territories like Niger and Mali in the Sahel are poorly covered. In 2020, something concerning happened in sub-Saharan Africa. For the first time since 2013, the number of people without access to electricity increased. Not only that, but sub-Saharan Africa also saw its share of the global population without electricity rise. Before the pandemic, it was at 74%, but it went up to 77% during the crisis. Now, when we talk about electricity, most of us have a vague idea of how we obtain it and how we produce it. But it is crucial to understand where our power comes from. Electricity starts with some kind of energy, which means that all of our ways to generate it are just fancy methods of converting a type of energy into another. In most cases, we convert it into heat. Most of this heated energy still comes from fossil fuel, that is coal, natural gas, derived gas, crude oil, and non-renewable wastes, which are the primary sources of electricity in Africa, but also the rest of the world. And then there is also water as a source of electricity in Africa. Right now, on average, hydropower makes up around 17% of the electricity generated on the continent. But in certain countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Malawi, Mozambique, Uganda, and Zambia, hydropower plays an even bigger role, accounting for over 80% of their electricity generation. Now, you're probably wondering why electricity access is volatile to this day. Well, according to a Mail and Guardian report published in January of this year, the running theme in what has become a continental 21st century nightmare is poor long-term planning and investment in a sector where infrastructure built by colonial power is still being used decades after independence. End of quote. In other words, a lot of the infrastructure available on the continent is simply worn out. Today, many African countries rely on state-owned power utilities. The problem is that the power generation capacity is also not keeping up with an increasing demand. And it's a familiar story for countries like Zimbabwe, where the constant breakdown of energy infrastructure dating back more than 6 decades is being blamed for 24-hour blackouts. In Nigeria, energy authorities have reported that in March last year, the national power grid collapsed twice, plunging the country into darkness. So why not update or build new infrastructure altogether, you might ask? And that's a fair question. Well, experts seem to gravitate toward two main root causes: poor planning and strategy, along with the mismanagement of funds. On the other hand, many African governments have argued that there isn't enough money allocated to the energy sector, at least coming from abroad. As far back as 2014, then Egyptian President El-Sisi blamed the power crisis in his country on the huge costs involved in financing the energy sector and poor investment. According to the World Bank, achieving universal access to electricity throughout sub-Saharan Africa will require $20 billion per year. But investors are being cautious about investing in African countries' energy sectors due to the global financial uncertainty, for example. Investment has also become a challenge in the midst of the world's changing perspective on climate and the environment. Like I've said earlier, many African countries rely heavily on fossil fuels like coal for power generation. It's the case for South Africa, for example, which has been going through a major energy supply crisis. In April, the government announced that it was considering postponing the closure of several coal-fired power stations so as to alleviate the problem of frequent power cuts in the country. But the climate change impact is real and has to be taken seriously. Malawi is a prime example of how climate uncertainty is having a crippling effect on power generation in a country where up to 98% of energy production is hydro-based, meaning relying on water. Malawi has been suffering from severe droughts with increasing frequency in the last few years. But while Western countries have repeatedly urged African nations to steer away from polluting plants, fossil fuels, and truly embrace renewable energy such as solar and wind power, which, like I said, is available in Africa, well, African leaders have also denounced the West's hypocrisy and double standard on these questions.
Voici des pays en Europe qui ont utilisé du charbon jusqu'à 30 ans. Voici des pays qui ont pollué le monde entier et maintenant on veut nous faire des leçons. Ah non, ce n'est pas acceptable. Nous sommes d'accord pour que le problème de l'environnement soit au cœur de ce que nous faisons. Mais qu'est-ce que l'Afrique représente en matière de pollution? 4%. Et les 96%, quels sont ceux qui le font? C'est les Occidentaux. Et vous vous êtes développés comment?
C'est de la malhonnêteté.
To be fair, the top 4 countries responsible for over 3/4 of the world's coal-fired electricity are not in Africa. We're talking about China, India, the United States, and Japan. And there have been some strides made in terms of overall access to electricity in certain regions of the continent, as you can see on this map. So ultimately, it's not all doom and gloom, and there is potential for progress. The positive impact that a renewable energy revolution could have on Africa's social and economic development is undeniable. But here's the catch. We need to change the way things are done. Right now, there's a strong focus on large-scale power projects and centralized electricity production. But to truly unlock the potential of renewable energy, some experts say that there needs to be a shift of attention towards more localized and resource-efficient options. And instead of lecturing us on our shortcomings, the rest of the world should effectively support this transition and not participate in plundering the very resources that contribute to global warming. That's just one side, of course, of this complex issue. And as usual, we urge you to share your thoughts on this electricity issue, the energy transition as well. That is, of course, some of the aspects of this very complex issue. And as usual, we urge you to share your thoughts with us in the comment section. Tell us how you feel about the energy problem on the continent and also ways of moving forward when it comes to electricity access for sub-Saharan Africa in particular. As usual, don't hesitate to share this video, like it, subscribe to our page, and I'll see you very soon. In the meantime, please stay safe.